Okay, so today we are picking up with equal justice under the law, looking at diversity and discrimination in American society. The U.S. has a heterogeneous population, which means that we have a mix of several ingredients in our population. Our population is predominantly white, and it has historically been predominantly white as well. However, our ethnic composition is changing in the U.S. We see an increase in African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and there are more females than males currently in the U.S. And because of these minority groups coming up, we're going to see episodes of discrimination against them. We're going to start with African Americans, and African Americans tend to be focused on for three reasons. The first is that they are the second largest minority group in the U.S. The second is that they have been victims of discrimination consistently and deliberately in our history. So they've constantly been picked on. And the third is that their equality and civil rights that they've earned was based on their efforts. It's not like the white people suddenly said, "Oh yeah, we treat you like crap. Let's change that." It's been through the efforts of the African American population that they've gained their civil rights. It's not like the white people were just like, "Yeah, let's just do this because it's the right thing." No, they didn't do that. The next group is Native Americans, and Native Americans have pretty much had a rough time since the whites first got here. The whites brought with them diseases, their land was taken away, they were forced onto reservations, and reservations are the public lands that are set aside by the government. As a result, throughout their recent history even, their life expectancy is very low. In fact, Native American people live on average 10 years less than whites do. They also have 3 times the infancy mortality rate as whites, and so they have suffered still as a population. The third group are Asian Americans, and Asian Americans have been resented for their labor, typically because they will work for cheap, like the Chinese. The Japanese were also discriminated against during World War II, put into relocation camps throughout the U.S. But they are also the fastest growing minority group in the U.S., and so there's kind of a tendency to look at them sort of like, why are you growing so fast? What bringing you here? Sort of thing. So they tend to get a lot of attention that way as well. Hispanic Americans are a very complex group because they're not all Mexicans. So a lot of people like to think they're all Mexicans. They're not. Hispanic Americans is a very complex group. You have white Hispanic Americans. You have mestizo, which is half white, half Native American Hispanic Americans. You have mulatto Hispanic Americans, and these are half white, half black Hispanic Americans. And then you have black Hispanic Americans. So they're a very complex group. They're a very diverse group. So you have all these different kind of mixtures. But the 4 main groups that have come to the U.S. have been Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Cuban Americans, and then a mixture of Central and South Americans like Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina. And most of them have been refugees from those areas, people who leave their home in order to seek refuge from war or from persecution in their home countries. So those are our major minority groups. Now, another minority group, which is not really a minority group, is women. And there's been a lot of discrimination against women throughout our history, just like any other minority group. But women are not a minority group because there are more women. I don't know if you caught this earlier, but there are more women than men in the U.S. today. So they're not a minority group. But they're still treated as less than equal, and they have been historically in our past. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 regulated that women needed to get the same pay for equal work. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that there could be no job discrimination based on sex. However, we still see a lot of discrepancy in that it's not always true. So, equality before law, looking at these minority groups that may or may not exist and how they are treated by law. The Equal Protection Clause comes from the 14th Amendment. And as you have been going through your case briefs, you come across this thing several times. Equal protection. And the Equal Protection Clause talks about basically when can you discriminate and when can't you discriminate. So, the first part of it talks about reasonable classification, that in certain ways the government must be able to discriminate. They must be able to say certain portions of the population deserve this kind of treatment. It helps to regulate human behavior. So, for example, if you want to get rid of smoking, if you want to make smoking illegal, or if you want to discourage smoking, you're going to tax all smokers. You're not just going to tax the male smokers, or you're not just going to tax the blonde smokers, or just the Hispanic smokers. You're going to tax all of them because it's a way for you to regulate human behavior. The second is called the rational basis test, and basically says there has to be a rational basis for why you're discriminating. And a great example of this would be statutory rape. When there's a statutory rape charged, somebody accused of it, the man is usually the one who's charged and the girl is not. And statutory rape just means it's not an actual physical rape. It's not an aggravated rape where he beats the crap out of her. Instead, it's two consenting people that are a certain age distance apart from each other. So it's like if you had a 17-year-old girl dating a 24-year-old guy, and the parents didn't like it, they could charge him with statutory rape. But the man is charged, the girl is not. So even though both were participating in it willingly, he's charged, but she's not. And the reason behind this, the rational basis for this, is that it's the government's purpose is to prevent teen pregnancy. And that the older individual, the man, would be the one who is more responsible, and so he has to take responsibility for his actions, basically. The third thing is the strict scrutiny test, and basically this is looking at if your fundamental rights are being protected. And so they're going to look at suspect classifications like sex or race, and seeing if there's a reason, if they think that discrimination is taking place, is there a reason for it? Does it fall under that reasonable classification? Does it follow that rational basis? And so this is why women and men are both eligible for alimony, not just women. And alimony is like when you get a divorce and your husband or your wife was really, really rich and you didn't work at home, or you didn't work because you didn't have to, you stayed at home with the kids. Well, if you get a divorce, then they have to pay you alimony, which is money, rather not just child support. It's in addition because you were kept out of the workforce, so you weren't able to build a career and support yourself, kind of thing. So with all this wonderful discrimination going on, we have segregation. And segregation is the legal separating of one group from another. And this started in the South with the Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow laws were aimed specifically at blacks. And this was in both public and private facilities like buses and schools and drinking fountains and swimming pools, all kinds of stuff, that there was set times or set places for blacks and set times and places for whites. And so this decision of segregation is going to be upheld in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which said that you could have separate facilities as long as they were of equal standard. But that will be challenged in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which said that separate but equal is inherently unequal, because by virtue of separating them, you are saying that there's something wrong with one of the groups. And so that is discrimination. You cannot do that. And so Brown versus Board of Education is going to end segregation, and they're supposed to do it with all deliberate speed, so it's supposed to be as fast as possible. Well, the problem with this is that Brown versus Board of Education is dealing with de jure segregation. And de jure segregation is separation by law. Well, you can abolish that. That's what Brown versus Board of Education gets rid of, de jure segregation. But it can't do anything about de facto segregation. And de facto segregation is where the races separated naturally without the law requiring it. So, for example, would be like housing patterns. Blacks would live by blacks and whites would live by whites. So you can't pass laws saying you have to buy a house next to a black person or you have to buy a house next to a Hispanic person or whatever. You can't do that. That's de facto. It is without the law requiring it. So it's much harder to combat that. Classification by sex. It is not unconstitutional for the government to make laws that are discriminatory based on sex. But again, they have to pass that reasonable classification and that rational basis. So, laws that make that distinction are not allowed unless, number one, it serves some important government objective, and number two, it is substantially related to achieving that goal. So, I know we've talked in class about the draft and how the goal of the draft is to raise an army, but women are excluded from the draft. Well, women in our history have also been excluded from combat, so it follows that they are excluded from the draft. They don't have to sign up because if you are drafted, you most likely are going to go into combat. So that's the rational basis behind it. Affirmative action. Affirmative action is a policy that requires most employers to take positive steps to remedy the effects of past discriminations. Basically, what it boils down to is they're supposed to hire more minorities and more females to make up for the lack of doing so in the 200 years prior to this, basically. This is going to lead to quotas, that companies will have quotas, that we need to have so many women working for us, and we need to have so many blacks, and we need to have so many Hispanics, and we need to have so many, so on, so on, so on. And so it meant that there was only a certain number of jobs for certain groups. Well, eventually this will be brought up to the Supreme Court that this is reverse discrimination, that we're discriminating against the majority group, which in this case is white males. And the case that will come before the court is the Bakke case, Bakke versus the University of California. And Bakke was trying to get into the medical program at the University of California. But 16 of the 100 seats were set aside for non-white applicants. And Bakke, who was a white student, charged the university with reverse discrimination because he did not get into the program. He said you can't just set aside 16 for lower qualified individuals. Well, he wins his case. The state or the Supreme Court agreed with him that yes, it was reverse discrimination. So he still fails to get into the program. So even though they opened up 16 more seats, he still didn't get in. But what happens is that the court realized that by upholding affirmative action, they were also then discriminating against the majority group. However, in later cases, quotas are going to be upheld because of long-standing discrimination in the past. So it's kind of a hit and miss on affirmative action. American citizenship. If you are a citizen of the U.S., you owe your allegiance to the U.S. And 90% of the people in the U.S. today are citizens. And they can do that by two ways. They can become citizens by birth. And there's two ways that you can become a citizen by birth. The first is jus soli, which is law of the soil. And that basically means if you're born on U.S. territory, which includes all 50 states, plus D.C. and our territories, plus our U.S. embassies in foreign countries, then you are automatically, by birth, because you were born on American soil, a U.S. citizen. The second way that you can be a citizen by birth is called jus sanguinis. And jus sanguinis is law of the blood, which means that if at least one of your parents is a U.S. citizen, by virtue of you being their child and born to them, you are automatically a citizen as well. So those are the two ways that you can become a citizen by birth. The other way that you can become a citizen is by naturalization. And naturalization is the legal process to become a citizen. And for individuals, how this works is that you come into the country as an alien. You come in as a citizen of another nation. And once you have fulfilled the requirements, you can become a citizen. So what are the requirements? Well, number one, you have to have lived here for at least 5 years. You also need to be at least 18 years old, and you have to have lived in one state for at least 3 months. At that point, you fill out number 2, which is filing the petition, filling out all the paperwork. The third requirement is that you must show that you are literate in the English language, that you can read and speak and write it. The fourth is that you show good moral character. So they'll do a lot of answering or asking questions of your employer or your neighbors, finding out what kind of person you are. The fifth is that you show knowledge and understanding of a U.S. history and government, and usually this is done by taking a test. It's also another way you can show that you know the English language. And the sixth is that you take an oath of allegiance, so you pledge allegiance to the flag. So that's how individuals can be naturalized. However, there's also a thing called collective naturalization. And collective naturalization is anytime that we acquire new territory, like we take on a new state or we add territory to the U.S. And rather than have every one of those people individually get naturalized, we just say as a group, you are now U.S. citizens because we now own the land that you're on. So that's a way to kind of get around that. Now, just because you are born a citizen or you are naturalized as a citizen doesn't mean you cannot lose your citizenship. You can. And there's two ways. The first is expatriation. And expatriation is the legal process of losing your citizenship, that it can be stripped from you. They can take it away. And there's not a whole lot of reasons why they do this, but a great example would be if you were fighting in another country's army or for their armed forces and serving their armed forces, that would be considered kind of treasonous to the U.S., and so you could have your citizenship stripped away. The other way is through denaturalization, and denaturalization is a court order that shows that you became a citizen by fraud or deception. So if you were a naturalized citizen and they showed that you're not really who you are, then they can take it away. So if it was a false identification that you used, they can take away your naturalized citizenship. So all kinds of fun stuff with individual rights.